What it's about really is the op-ed, which was CY Leung is the winner. So I started to think about winners and losers in this process. And as I started to think about that, the last 2 days, I started to think about it in a creative way, I hope, more than just saying who wins, who loses, but to put it in the context of one country, two systems, right? And to think about, and this is just, you know, we can play with this as we go, right? And I'll play with this a bit, that where Hong Kong was before Occupy Central, in terms of the distribution of power, influence, strength, anticipated impact, things like that, right? And where it is today after Occupy Central. And my argument, in a nutshell, would be before Occupy Central, we were probably over here. In terms of movement from here this way, we've had two major events. One was the white paper, which came out of Beijing, which basically made two major points. One was that Hong Kong's autonomy was granted by the central government, and that really any sense, the sense is the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, right? Or the Lord can take away if he or she feels like they would like to do so. So that was the way it was perceived in Hong Kong. Whereas all along, people had felt that Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy was some kind of really independent force. I mean, it was something that was declared, and it would be there for most of the 50 years, right? And that was the way it was going to be. The other thing that it said that judges were civil servants and therefore owed the obligation to loyalty to the state, which really got a lot of people in the courts and made people very nervous about the rule of law, which is one of the pillars of Hong Kong society, right? And one of Hong Kong's comparative advantages. So that was the first thing that happened. And then the second thing was what we just call 831 now, right? August 31st, which laid out the framework for the next election of the chief executive, and which establishes a framework which is very restrictive and basically means only pro-Beijing people will get past the post and not become candidates. Don't need to go into more detail. So both of those things, right, started to push this way. But I would say, and I guess this is why Stan said it's sort of in the op-ed too, but I would say that overall, if you want to think about it, Occupy Central was an absolute failure. Because what it did was move us, I'd say, over here and make Beijing feel that it can push, that it has the need to push, and it now has a social basis to push, because it was mobilized. People, anti-Occupy Central forces were mobilized. In terms of the votes, there were 800,000 people who came out pro-Occupy Central. 1.5 million people came out against Occupy Central. Drummed up, however you want to say it, but those kinds of messages were out there, and those kinds of messages to Beijing. So, overall, I would say, and I'll go through this in the individual case, sort of individual groups break down different interests in Hong Kong and make that argument. Why do I say that it was a failure? First of all, I think that CY Leung is much more powerful today than he was previously. I mean, here was a guy who was hanging by a thread, and a narrow thread as it was, when we talked back in April, May, and many of us were writing scenarios about the future was a Hong Kong without CY Leung. And Occupy Central made it even look more likely that we were going to get a Hong Kong without CY Leung very quickly. Would he survive the week? Would he survive the month? Would Beijing step in and take him out during Occupy Central? People thought would happen. Didn't happen, right? Now he's back there, and in many ways, he's probably Beijing's hero. He managed this situation. A serious crisis for Beijing, right? This could have been Tiananmen Square, right? We could have had, kids getting killed in the streets of Hong Kong. We could have had violence in the streets of Hong Kong, which didn't happen. Now, I will say that's largely to the credit of the students. I think the students did a great job, though there were people in Mongkok who wanted to fight, but the students did a great job, but so did the police. As much bad press as they get, I have some very good friends in the police force, and they were very cautious. The other thing is, Xi Jinping also had a slogan which was, no concessions, no blood. That's what we heard coming down from Beijing. So everybody played a role in this being a moderate outcome, but you still got to say CY is, in that sense, is a real big winner. The leaders of the movement, going in for jail, being called in. This week, Jimmy Lai got called in, and then they let him go. Jimmy Lai was the head of Next Media, called him in, and then said, you can go, but we have the right to call you in again. Right? So he's on notice. So one of the main people involved. If you read his policy address, CY's policy address, the tone was very aggressive. This was not the tone of a guy who's afraid that if he makes a mistake, he's in trouble. This was a guy who basically said to the Democrats, smarten up. Rule of law. Don't break the law. If you break the law, you're going to get in trouble. I'm the boss. Came out very much that way. Policies, he's still got a way to go on his policies, but he always promised to take care of the poor. That was one of the reasons why some of us, many people in Hong Kong, actually welcomed his being the chief executive, because we thought he was going to deal with the social issues, which I think are the main problems. And it was actually, in many ways, when you think about Occupy Central, a lot of the push actually came from social issues, which we can talk about. So CY, in some ways, wins on that. And he's got 2 more years at least to give money, to find ways to improve the environment, to do what he needs to do to try and fulfill his agenda. If, in fact, the Democrats vote down, this is part of one of the points I made in my op-ed, if, in fact, there's going to be now the Hong Kong government will put forward a proposal for democratic reform. And that proposal will include 831, right? The idea that you need 50% of the nominating committee to go forward to the election. The Democrats have said that they will vote that down. If they vote that down, one assumes we'll go back to the election committee, which means that the chief executive will be selected or elected by 1,200 people. If that's true, CY's got 2 years to start buying those people off, right? Start making his relationships, building his ties, right? Right now, he's only got 2 tycoons that like him. Most of the tycoons all hated him before, but at least he's got time now from a position of strength to work on that. And one thing he did, which was supposedly very popular, C.H. Tung has said this was a good thing, is he picked out the students from Hong Kong U who have written this article or written some stuff about high degree of autonomy, where they see the high degree of autonomy sort of way over here, right? That it's really about 2 systems, and that Hong Kong is almost an independent system. And Beijing loves that kind of talk. They love to hear that there's autonomy, people yelling for autonomy, independence out there, because it's just not there. But it empowers them, right? At one point, I met the head of an independence movement in Hong Kong. I had breakfast with him. I asked him how many members he had in his association, and he said, yeah, I've got a really lot of members. I have 150 people, right? And they were all over in Mongkok. And it's really, nobody thinks about independence. But Beijing likes to hear that, and so here's CY focusing on independence, and then yesterday or 2 days ago, C.H. Tung came out, the former chief executive, and reinforced that view and said it's appropriate that C.Y. Leung talked about that in his policy address, and he said, had I been chief executive at this time, I would have done the same thing. So, I mean, I think that's reasonably nasty. Second winner, Beijing. Beijing's the winner. based on its no concession, no bloodshed, that won the day. A potential disaster, as I said, goes away. The white paper is still on the table. So all the things that they said about the white paper and the lower level degree of autonomy that Hong Kong actually has is really still on the table. 831, right? Still on the table. No concession on it. So that they're going to be in control of the candidates. And if you follow sort of the speeches, the talks, the murmurs, the China Daily, the articles, everybody's talking about national security law, which was the 2003 law. National education is back on the table. It's now being called renewal, the renewal of the education system, where young people are to be almost re-educated. We almost hear this kind of language of Zai Jiao Yu, you know, Gai Zhao Sisyang, right? Re-education, right? And that seems to be, we hear more about it. Students going to the mainland more frequently. Some people in the China Daily have called for the tycoons to put up more money to establish exchange programs. Beijing's also not forced to make a concession on 2022. I think that's very important. So they did not have to say, this round we will have this narrow electoral nomination process, but the next round we're going to change the rules. They didn't have to make that. Now, what's the problem of Beijing feeling that it's a winner? Is that, well, I've already said some of that, the call for enlightenment, that CH has called for the reintroduction of national security law. I think just in general, Beijing feels, because of the way the students behaved, that it really needs to tighten up. That, you know, when we talked a lot about sort of the view from Beijing, now Hong Kong is one of 4 problems. Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is now lumped into this kind of territorial mafan, right? A local mafan, right, that has to be handled, right? And therefore the concessions may be, we can't make concessions. You can't make concessions to the Tibetan separatists, right? You can't make concessions to the Taiwan separatists. Well, now if they start making this up as I go along, but it makes sense, right? Now you can't make concessions to Hong Kong because Hong Kong's full of separatists, right? So how can you make any concessions? So again, it moves it much more along here. Now the students did remarkably well initially. There's no doubt, right? They were well behaved. They actually took over the movement, right? They called a student boycott for 1 week of classes. My students boycotted classes, and then bingo, right? It took off. And it really took off on the 28th of September. At that night, the police decided that they were going to use tear gas. As soon as the word came out that they were using tear gas, I live here on McDonald Road, right? Madonaldo, right? And here's Admiralty here, and so I walked down to as soon as I heard that that they had used tear gas, I went down. The Admiralty was just thousands of people, right? Moving food down, bringing stuff in. I should actually have some photos from that night, but I don't know if I ever posted them. But then all of a sudden I heard that stuff was going on in Central. So I ran down to Central and got next to the Hong Kong Club, at which point right here, actually it was this way, right? At this point there were lines of people right there, and the police were there. And I watched for a bit, and then the police put up a sign and said, "Be careful, we're using tear gas." And so for the first time in my life, despite being a leftist student in the 1960s, I got tear gassed. Right? Ta-da. But the students did you know, really well initially. But 5 days later, I went on CNN and I said, great guys, you've done really well, go home. I said, you've made the point, you've got the message through, you have the power to put 100,000 people or more back on the streets, go away. Well, they didn't listen, and in fact, they may have been right, because one thing that they did get was they got the right to sit down with the government in a face-to-face negotiation. My view was at that point, change what you're bargaining for. They should have gone in there and not asked for the repeal of 831, which was never going to happen. And I can explain later if someone wants to ask me why China could not give a package other than 831, right? The 50% nomination. But the students could have gone in there and talked about the functional constituencies. They could have talked about trying to expand, change the nomination committee. They could have tried a number of things, but they didn't. They went in, they took a hardline position, and basically the government said, no deal. Carrie Lam met with them, no deal. So that's when the students really start to decline, right? At that point, they have nothing left. They've put forward a position that is unacceptable to the government, and at that point, we as citizens are already starting to say, look, you know, it was one thing for us to be disrupted in traffic to, you know, for this purpose. Now you're just ruining my life, right? Adding 45 minutes every day to try and get out to the university, right, from here. 45 minutes every day. Coming home, 3 lineups I had to get into every day. You know, I'm a supporter. You know, when people said to me, how could you let your students go and do this? I said, if I were them, I would have done it. I was out there in the 60s. How could I say to people, you can't do it, right? So anyway, the problem, I think, with the students was that they gave Beijing the reason and a justification to say that, you know, your mentality, your understanding of one country, 2 systems is way too far over here, and you need to move to the other side. If you couldn't understand why 831 is necessary, if you can't understand why we could only have patriotic person as the chief executive, if you don't understand that, you have an improper understanding of the 2 systems and one country. You have an imbalance. You're far too far over here, and we need to explain to you and make sure that future generations are much more over on this side. Okay. Also, Chinese identity. We can talk a little bit about the whole question of identity, too. And Sunny Lo talks about strengthening Chinese identity because most Hong Kongers feel that they are Hong Kongers. And the students definitely feel that they're Hong Kongers. They have no Chinese identity separate from, you know, just sort of this, very few people have this Chinese identity. So, who else are big losers? The Democrats, right? Completely. They played no role, almost no role in this. I saw my friend Albert Ho, who I like a lot, running around trying to do something. I mean, the best thing they could do was get arrested. Right? It's true. Him and everybody else. And it's really a problem. One of the reasons that the Democratic Party is the loser is that the Democratic Party really had a chance to be the middle, the moderate. They had a chance, maybe. I mean, Albert Ho, I was told, was considered patriotic. What's her name? The journalist who's become the head of the Democratic Party. Emily Lau, right? I've been told that Emily and Albert are both considered to be Democratic. Albert largely because the Diaoyutai, his early positions on that. So he seemed to be Democratic. If he seemed to be Democratic, then maybe he could be he could make it past the 50%, right? And I think that if I were Beijing, you know, and you want to get rid of the accusation that you're rejecting all Democrats, the best thing you could do would be to cut a deal with Albert Ho and say, Albert, look, you should run. We'll let you run, right? He's run before, let him run, right? But now he can't do that. He can't do it because Occupy Central radicalized the situation. And were he to try and do that, it would split the Democratic camp terribly. And in fact, he and Emily have had to move more and more to the left, largely because of the Occupy Central movement. Big winners, pro-Beijing people in Hong Kong, right? So Regina's a winner, right? Who else? Who else did I put? Well, anybody who thinks that they want to run for chief executive and is a conservative is now in a much better position because there's going to be no powerful Democrats running against them. So they like the emphasis on one country. The emphasis on one country is good for the tycoons, right? The less if there's nobody elected on a really democratic platform, then there's going to be less pressure for wealth redistribution, for possibly for improved housing, though I think CY will try and improve on that. But overall, I think that one country favors the interests of the conservative forces in Beijing. I mean, you see them come out in the media. One thing, though, one problem for them, and I don't think this is related specifically to this, is that they're going to be at each other's throats. It's going to be interesting to watch over the next 2 years how conservatives in Hong Kong are going to be getting out the knives to go after each other. Maybe we'll discover more and more basements that have been built, or some kind of property stuff that's inappropriate. And we also don't know how they're going to be selected. So there's going to be a lot of lobbying by people probably going up to Beijing. Now, one thing Francis Lui and the sort of the anti-Occupy Central forces have argued for the election goes back to Anthony Downs' economic theory of democracy, for those of you who are political scientists. And his argument is that very often, particularly in a two-person election race, you wind up at the middle, right? And I think that when you think of the Hong Kong election, you're going to have, let's say, sort of left, right, left or society, right, and then over here, pro-Beijing, and that if there's 2 or 3 people, there is going to be pressure for some to move to the middle, because there's all this voting bloc, all these people will be involved in the vote, right? And if you're 2 very conservative people standing here, someone's going to say, well, if I move a little bit to the left, I've got these people will vote for me. So there's something to be said for, again, for accepting the deal, which I'm in favor of, 831 taking the deal, even though it's not a good deal. I would say that my good friend Dixon Singh, who opposes the deal, says that what it does is it legitimizes an illegitimate electoral process. And whoever gets elected under this process will have some greater degree of legitimacy than he or she would if they were elected by an election committee, which is obviously illegitimate. Okay? Last point I would make before concluding: how does the rule of law do in all this? Right? It's almost an independent player in Hong Kong. We grow up, or we live in Hong Kong, and we're always talking about the rule of law, right? How did the rule of law do? It did okay. You know, the judges, I mean, I have some good friends who are judges, and they are adamant that they will not move towards one country. That as much as the white paper suggests that they owe loyalty to the state rather than to, Hong Kong being its own unique legal system, they're going to resist that. But nevertheless, they are under pressure. And that it will be one of the places to watch if we get some kind of shift. Now, you've got the 4th plenum, just happened in Beijing, emphasis on the rule of law under the leadership of the Communist Party, which many of us would interpret as rule by law rather than rule of law, and therefore there will be pressure. And C.Y. Leung has already talked about the importance of, they keep harping on the fact that the students broke the law. Well, the students knew that they were breaking the law, and part of the whole process of civil disobedience is to accept the rule of law and that you get arrested for what you're doing. And so they were very quickly to turn themselves in and say, yes, yes, we broke the law. But we'll see how this goes. Anyway, concluding, I think we're going to feel great pressure in Hong Kong because we've moved over here. Beijing feels comfortable. Beijing feels that it can put great pressure. We will see United Front organizations in Hong Kong. United Front are pro-Beijing, popular organizations. We'll see pressure from them. We've already started to see very quickly articles in Hong Kong Daily. We're all a little upset by the chairman of the political science department at the Hong Kong Institute of Education, who has taken now what is clearly seen to be a pro-national education perspective, which is somewhat troubling to all of us. He was my student back in 1986, back in Canada. So we're starting to see the shift in the society. I think many more people will say that we have to take 831, people like me, even saying that that's a deal we should take, but I would not put, the last thing I would say is don't ever underestimate the strength of Hong Kong society, right? We've seen three counter measures, counter strengths, three mobilizations. We saw it for national education. First, we saw it in 2003 for the national security law. 500,000 people on the streets the first year, 350 on the second year. C.H. Tung was gone, right? Then we saw it in 2012 for the first effort at national education. And then we've seen an amazing mobilization of Hong Kong society in response to really 831 and the effort to move Hong Kong this way. So I wouldn't underestimate Hong Kong society, its vibrancy, its desire for maintaining this, but I think that the pressure is really coming down hard. Thank you very much.